This discussion. My name is Amrita Chaudhary, and on behalf of CCAOI, we welcome you to this stakeholder discussion, which is termed as Manthan, Impact of Network Usage Fees and Selective Blocking. So many of you may be aware that TRAI recently came up with a consultation paper on this topic, and this discussion is being facilitated to understand more on the concepts of network usage fees, selective banning, and to also deliberate what its impacts are. Are there any possible solutions to address the issues, which telcos are facing, and also to balance India's economic and security interests while protecting consumer rights, the neutrality of the internet, and also encouraging free trade and startups to blossom. So this session is being recorded and live streamed. And as an outcome of this discussion, we will come up with a report with the key takeaways and suggestions, which we will be circulating to all stakeholders, such as you, the decision makers, and also with our submission to TRAI. And we also want to encourage all stakeholders, including you, to make submissions to the regulatory authority. So we have a very distinguished panel of speakers with us today who would be sharing their perspectives on the topic. We want it to be interactive, and we want to encourage you to share your views or queries in the chat. And in case you have any questions, you could prefix it with a question. And if there is a comment, you could prefix it with a comment. And during the open house, you can raise your hand, and you can ask your questions. In case there are some comments and questions in the chat, the speakers may want to address it in the chat too. Do note that while you are speaking or making an intervention during the open house, do mention your name and affiliation. Also, while we encourage you to actively participate and share your views, we want you to be respectful and courteous to each other, even if your views differ. No abusive language or personal attacks would be tolerated. And if you're not speaking, if you could keep your mics muted. So after me, we will have Gowree, Gokhale from Nishith, Desai and Associates, who would be giving you an overview of the developments in India about this topic. And then we have Alexandre Roure from Computer and Communications Industry Association, who would be sharing the European story of what the developments are happening at the EU level. Then we have a panel discussion with esteemed speakers. We have Anjali from Vodafone India Idea Limited. We have Dr. Mahesh Uppal, who is a known telecom expert. Also Parag, who is a telecom expert and was earlier in Qualcomm. We have Tejasi Panjiar, who is from Internet Freedom Foundation. Uttara Ganesh from Snap. We have Vartika Mishra from NASCOM. Gopal Jain was supposed to be part of this discussion, but he had his court cases kind of postponed, so he may join us later. And this would obviously be followed by an open discussion. Since we have a very tight schedule, therefore would request our esteemed speakers to keep a tab on the time. With that, I would hand it over to you, Gowree.
Thank you, Amrita. Thanks for inviting me on this topic. It made me once again read the 100-page document that has been produced by TRAI. So all of us are aware, of course, we will discuss about the consultation paper, which is the topic of today's discussion. But whether we like it or not, there are so many parallel developments that all of us need to keep tab on, because what is happening with one regulator or one ministry will have an impact on what is happening, on the consultations with the other ministry as well. Just to take an example, this entire discussion on OTT and the framework, whether it should be regulated, not regulated, is not new. It has been a decade-old conversation. Within that, 1 decade, we saw several regulations, coming in one by one. For example, in the earlier conversations, when we talk about OTT, there were conversations about, the entire bunch of OTT services, right? Now we see that MIB has already come out with regulations to govern, say, publishers, which are, OCCPs as they call it, right? Then you also have in parallel, telecom bill came in, which threw everybody, sort of, off, because there were so many things. The broadcasting thus far was regulated as a broadcasting service under MIB, but suddenly telecom bill basically called out broadcasting service as a part of as a part of the telecom bill regulated service, right? So there are these parallel conversations. So there is a telecom bill under consultation already. The comments have been received. We understand that there will be next version that we will see. I don't think in this monsoon session, but let's see when. The next development, of course, when we talk about OTT, as I said, the Information Technology Act, under which some of these OTTs are regulated, and I'm using the term OTT broadly here, which are regulated, is also under consultation for Digital India Act, right? The reason I bring this up is because in the prior TRAI consultations, and I will just move the slide. So let's see what has happened over a period of time. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, I'm not going to go. Sorry. Yes, I have done that. I'm not sure whether you can see the full screen. Yeah, perfect. So, there have been back and forth consultation, and this is called, if you see, it's the back reference, because, TRAI did come out with certain consultation paper in 2020, and there were certain recommendations made. And the DOT said no on these specific two issues, which I will come to. There is a reference back. That means TRAI has to reconsider some of the questions. Now, if you see, at the right bottom corner, there was, for example, a question on privacy and security issues on the OTT service. Now, we already know tomorrow, as we speak, the data protection bill, is about to be tabled before the parliament, right? So therefore, some of these things which have happened in parallel may not be that relevant now, and that is why, if you see in the consultation paper also, TRA has not dealt with the privacy and security issue. They have dealt with only two issues, as I said. Now, the back reference is on two aspects, right? Two reasons. Basically, because from the time that it was last discussed, there has been tremendous growth on the OTT service, and it has reached mature stage, because that time TRA had mentioned that this is not the right time to intervene, right? So is it the right time to intervene? That question is one more time on the table. Next one is, of course, there has been, and all of us are aware, and this issue consistently comes up when India is internationally also viewed, when there is an internet shutdown. And we know that there are, even, the G20 conversation that we had recently, which the MHA was hosting on 13-14 July in Delhi, it was 20 countries plus 9 countries. And in front of, the entire world population almost, this question was raised as to why is India doing internet shutdown, right? So there have been Supreme Court cases, and we will see that. So this is the second issue, that can you not shut down the internet in case of urgency, but do a selective banning, on the of certain OTC services for the security and public order reasons. So these are the two specific issues. Now let us see, and I'm going to run very fast because there is a panel which is going to delve into all these things in more detail. I'm just going to do the tone setting for what are the issues to be discussed. So what are the questions raised? Because if you know TRAI, the way it functions, it lays down, complete background. This is what TRAI has done. International definitions, international precedents. So chapter 4 discusses various countries, what are the developments on these two issues. Internet shutdown, if you really see, is not discussed much, in the international scheme of things. But, how to regulate OTT communication service is being discussed. And that is where, they have given certain definitions. So the first question is, what is OTT service? Now, honestly, this we have discussed for almost a decade. And more or less, everybody agrees, which have, summarized below. It is the OTC service is are the services or applications or content provided over the public internet. So I don't think that is going to be much deliberation on this definition, but the question has been raised. Please define what is OTT service and what are the intelligible differentia basis which the OTT services can be characterized further, or sort of classified further. So the DOT in the past has divided that into OTT communication service and OTT application service, right? And when it comes to OTT communication service, they have identified two features of that. One is accessed, of course, over the public internet, which is a characterization of OTT service as we discussed, and it's a direct functional substitute. And I'm going to use the word substitute because it is being used in the paper, and there is a huge debate whether these are in fact substitutable or not. But as I said, I'm not going to delve into that. But the next feature is it has to be direct substitute for traditional telecom service provided by the telcos, right? So therefore, the questions raised are mainly, 4 questions. Define OTT service, give classification of that based on intelligible differentia. And the term intelligible differentia, those of you are not aware, comes from the Article 14 of the Constitution, where they say that if you have to distinguish between services or have to, put certain bucket services in the same bucket, you have to apply, which is intelligible differentia, but that should have nexus. So the objective sought to be achieved. So when we look at this, I don't think we need to look at it only in the context of intelligible differentia, but also in the context of nexus to the objective sought to be achieved. That is my view on the table. And of course, then they talk about the definition and features of what is telecommunication service. Please give that. And within that also, are there any differences? For example, like we saw in the, and Amrita, I'm going to tell you to ping me when my time is almost out, so I can wrap up accordingly. So the next question arises is where like for example, we saw in the social media scheme of things, where it was you said social media and intermediary and social media, right? So social media, basically, where they said the primary activity should be of the social media, right? So within communication also, if some app has only chat feature, does it amount to communication service? These are the questions which will be raised. For example, you have a food delivery service. Can you say within that there is a chat feature, therefore it becomes a communication service, right? So those issues will arise. Now the question is, why is that issue arising? Why is this being discussed? The background being, as all of us are aware, and this has been a constant debate between the telcos and the OTTs, is that the telcos, what is the argument by the telcos, that we are putting all the infrastructure in place, we are bearing costs, we are paying the license fee, right? And in that context, we are losing out on revenue, because SMS, we are losing out of SMS fee, we are losing out on long distance telephone fees, etc. And the data fee that we get is not commensurate with the loss that we are suffering. So therefore, the question is, should there be, first of all, as I said, after all this characterization, there are 3 issues that arise. One is, do the communication services and telcos, need similar regulation? Because today the regulations are different. The telcos are governed by 3 acts, as we know, and the OTTs are governed by the Information Technology Act, right, which is again undergoing consultation. So the question is, should there be a same regulation? That is point number 1. And point number 2 is, should there be a voluntary commercial agreement, as has been recommended by ITU in the past, right? So these are the basically 2 questions, and they have given excellent summary of the obligations in 2.67 to 2.70 of the paper. They have given what all the telcos have to abide by. Then the OTTs have been discussed in 2.71 and 2.72 gives this table as to the comparison on the regulatory framework. And in that context, these are the 3 questions raised, whether they are comparable, whether a similar licensing condition should be applicable to communication services, and the need for, aspect that which I mentioned on the revenue share, right? So these are the 3 questions.
You would have to speed up a bit.
Yeah, this is the last point now, is which I think internet I've already covered, internet shutdown. So the question that is being raised is there a possibility, and these are the provisions I'll not go into under the Telecom Act and the IT Act, is there a possibility of a selective app shutdown when there is a public order issue? That is a technical question raised, because the earlier feedback has been that such selective ban technically may not be possible, because right now it is done at the ISP level closure, and therefore they are saying that the consultation is on the technical aspect of the shutdown, right? So with that, Amrita, I'll hand it back. I have already covered what are the parallel developments, so I'll not repeat that part. And over to you, Amrita. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Gowree, and we will wait for your comments later on also if you have some. And just for others, this presentation would later be shared, so you will have access to it. And Alex, we come to you while Gowree laid out the overview of what's happening in India and what the TRAI is asking for. Let's hear from you on what's been happening in Europe. So over to you. We can't hear you, Alex.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting CCAA Europe to give a little bit of perspective on how the debate on network usage fees in Europe is playing out, has been playing out for the past year and a half or so. Just a couple of words. CCAA Europe is a trade association representing a wide range of internet and of online content and service providers. We have offices in Washington, DC, but also in Brussels. I myself am based in Brussels. And obviously this issue of network usage fees has been one of the hottest topics for the past year or so, which is sort of animated the Brussels bubble, as we call it. So if we, first of all, if we look at where we are in the debate today, the debate really started or restarted, because it's not a new issue, restarted about a year and a half ago or so. Two associations came out, namely ETNO and GSMA, representing the telecom sector. And they've been essentially sort of pushing for this new / old, we would argue old campaign, because again, these are not new ideas, that content providers and online service providers, or at least some of them, should be charged for the traffic that they send over to their networks. But really, if you when you're on the ground, it's very clear that, of course, you have those two associations representing the entire sector. But what we really have is really just a handful of telecom incumbents out there. We're not talking about really the competitive ISPs in Europe. Those guys actually have expressed reservations, but quite publicly, about the introduction of network usage fees. It's important to note that this campaign is really targeted at specific, at least in Europe. It's not trying to catch every content and application service providers, at least not directly. It's really trying to focus. It's basically naming just a handful of companies that are sort of like the largest tech companies in the world. On the other side of the debate, so you have those pushing for that campaign. On the other side of the debate, you have many stakeholders that have voiced strong concerns, starting with the overwhelming majority of European regulators, which basically see no market failure so far, at least in Europe, and actually see quite a few risks when it comes to competition, when it comes to consumer welfare, both in terms of quality of service, but also in terms of prices, not just for subscriptions, but also for access to online services. In other words, from the regulator's perspective, I think reports after reports, it's very clear for them that Europe stands to lose plenty on this, and it's hard for them to see what Europe collectively would have to gain from that. As I said, these aren't new. This is not a new campaign. We've seen it in 2012. The same European telco incumbents have pushed a similar campaign at the ITU. Several countries, including European countries, European governments, the European Commission, had actually sort of flat out rejected that proposal back then. And the arguments underlying that campaign are pretty much similar to what they were back in the days. And if we go through some of those arguments, I'll skip some of the slides here. But so one of the arguments that they will raise is that the tech giants generate, or as a matter of fact, OTTs or content application service providers, however you want to call them, they generate traffic, right? So that already is a misconception right from the start. The telecom regulators here in Europe have been very clear and set the record straight. Companies do not generate traffic. Traffic is requested and thus caused by ISPs customers in the first place. The second argument that they are putting forth is that there's been an exponential growth of traffic in Europe and probably also around the world, but this is a European debate. So, and if you actually look at the facts over the past couple of years, right in the middle of COVID and right after COVID now, we are seeing actually a declining traffic growth when it comes to traffic passing through the networks. Again, it's you know, the point has been made not just by studies, but again by telecom regulators here in Europe. And of course, from the telecom incumbents' perspective, they will argue that this traffic generate ever-increasing costs. But again, there's several studies out there that shows that actually there's no real correlation between the growth of traffic and the minor sort of incremental growth or increase in the cost related to the handling of that traffic from the point of view of those ISPs. I would invite you to, I'll send a couple of links after I'm done because there are some, I think, useful resources that you can look at. And there are also global resources, they're not just European, for the European debate. Another argument that has been made for the past year or so is that somehow tech companies have no incentives to invest in networks. They just dump the traffic onto European telecom networks. And again, the fact speaks for themselves. Year on year, just in Europe alone, tech companies have invested 22 billion euros. So that's every year overall for the period of 2011 to 2021. Only in Europe, tech companies have invested over 180 billion euros. And I believe that in Asia Pacific region, that figure is actually higher, I think somewhere around 270 billion euros. Again, I'll share that study with you in the chat afterwards. Telecom regulators are very quick, telecom operators are very quick to say, well, don't worry, you know, there's nothing to be concerned about net neutrality rules. We're not trying to reopen net neutrality rules. These are rules that have been, you know, they're strong rules that we've had since 2014 here in Europe. And that's pretty much what their only arguments. But the reality is that, of course, when you talk about a network usage fee mechanism, you necessarily, especially when it's targeted just at a handful of companies, what you are doing effectively is that you discriminate or you're treating some companies' traffic differently from others, not necessarily just from a technical perspective, but also from an economic perspective. Under European rules, the Court of Justice here in Europe has been very clear. Economic or technical differentiated treatment constitute a violation of net neutrality rules. Again, the telecom regulators have expressed their concerns about that. So has consumer associations, as well as digital rights NGOs. And then in Europe, we have, and I'm sure it's the same in India, we have this broad political commitment to make sure that we have wide 5G and fiber rollouts by 2030 across the entire continent. And what the telcos would argue is that, well, we need extra funding because right now we don't have that funding in order to reach this target by 2030. Interestingly, a recent study that was conducted for the European Commission was recently published just a few weeks ago, which basically put a price tag on, the extra funding that needs to be put out there. It's really around 175 to 200 billion euros that are needed for wide 5G and fiber rollouts by 2030. Interestingly, if you look at the telecommunication operators' own claims, they say for over the past 10 years, we've invested 55 billion euros every year. So by this logic, really, it's going to be really easy for them, for telecom operators already today to achieve those targets either within the next couple of years or so, if they continue at the same investment rates, or they can, alternatively, they can choose to actually lower their investment rates and actually halve them to meet their EU connectivity goals by 2030. So there's really no need for additional funding through network fees for telecom operators to continue investing and reach those connectivity targets that we have here in Europe. And just to say that there's really so far just one country that has implemented that system, and that's Korea. And from our point of view, we think that this experiment has failed. Yes, Korea has the shiniest networks, or one of the shiniest networks in the world. But unfortunately, if you look at, for example, the latency rates, Korea scores as the lowest latency of all OECD countries. Network fees as such create an incentive for caps or OTTs, as you call them, to actually put data outside the country. And therefore, that basically reduces latency to the point that it doesn't matter if you have 5G or fiber and all your shiny networks. If the data end up being stored elsewhere far from the user, then you're going to have latency issues. Interestingly, the network fees in Korea hasn't stopped the telecom incumbents from dramatically increasing 5G subscription. Now, I think it's to the tune of $100 for 5G subscription in Korea. So, of course, there is, that hasn't stopped the telecom or incumbents in Korea to skyrocket those subscriptions. Also, interestingly, Koreans are actually now reverting back to 4G subscriptions because there's just no demand for it. There's no killer app, if I may say. There's no app that actually absolutely need 5G right now to run on devices, on mobile devices at this point. So again, it's not an ideal scenario from our perspective, but we are where we are, and I'll stop here. But the facts, as far as we're concerned, speak for themselves. There's a lot of technical discussion, but there's also political discussions. And you would be forgiven for thinking that, well, Europe is, the debate in Europe should be settled by now, but it's not. There are political considerations. The Commission is still thinking about this option as a possibility for a new legislation in autumn this year. And we'll see where we land on this topic. But it sure is something that is going to keep us busy for the next few months or so. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Alex, and we will look forward to your interventions later. And I'm sorry, I'm having some issues with my video, so I'm not being able to switch it on. But we'll now go to the panel discussion, and we have our speakers here to share their point of view. I may first, I would request my speakers to, keep their first interventions to about 6 minutes so that we can have a next round of counter comments. So, I would perhaps start with Anjali. Do you want to go first, or do you want to go later? Because you represent
I think I'm going to be the
perspective.
single voice standing up for some.
No, not really. As in, see, everyone has concerns, and the telcos also have some concern that needs to be resolved some way. There could be alternate ways. For example, that's something which personally we from CCAOI have been saying, that spectrum fees, etc., could be looked at as alternate ways to look at the costs, the burdens which telcos have. But yes, as an Anjali, let's hear from the telcos now.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Amrita. Thanks so much. Good afternoon. So I'll jump straight into the three issues that I think are being tabled. One is the OTT communication services. The second is on the internet shutdown, and the third is on the network usage fee. On OTT communication services, the fact that the telco people have been saying same service, same rules. These services which are being offered, the communication services, are direct substitutes for the services, the voice and messaging services that are offered by the telcos. I'm not getting into the technicalities of how it is different, but functionally the consumer views them as absolutely substitutable. When the telco community talks about same service, same rules, the view is that it should be the same for both. We are not saying burden the OTT comm players, but yes, please bring my regulation down, make it a more future fit regulation where it is light touch for all. So that is something that I would like to table, that it is not the intention to drag people down, but to lift people up. That's my view on OTT comms. On internet shutdown, yes, there has been a lot of concern about how basic daily use services and consumers are getting affected. How, given that digital is now the platform and daily lives of consumers are run on connectivity, internet shutdowns do affect it drastically. So this point that has been raised by DOT is a very important one, to say that how do we match the consumer requirements, but also maintaining that there may be some shutdown that is required for law and order. So whether we call it selective blocking or we call it selective unblocking, the technical things will have to be figured out. I'm sorry, I'm not a technical person, so I cannot answer these questions, but whether it is done by the ISP or maybe even by the OTT community, possibly, if the blocking can be done at their end to achieve the requirements of the government, we should look at all solutions to say that make it a narrow kind of application rather than a broad, approach that hurts everybody. On the third part, which is on the network usage fee, clearly this is something which is being debated in many countries in the world. Views have been taken, positions are being taken, the dialogue has started, and our request is that India too should start discussing these issues. We should have an India specific conversation. All that we have right now is X country did this, Y country did that. Point is, telecom is concerned. Sustainability of the networks is an issue. There is a problem. How it is to be solved is a conversation that needs to be started. Fair share for the people who are using the network. It's a product. It's a valid kind of view. And I would just like to say that India too needs to look at what is happening around the world and start discussing it. on an India-specific mode. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali, and you kept to the time. Thank you so much. You will obviously be getting time to kind of come back with your comments. Perhaps I would like to bring Parag in now because, he has been looking at the technical aspects of selective banning, and he's written extensively on it, and he has his views. So Parag, may I, request you to share your views on the topic?
Yeah, thank you. So look, because we have got limited time, I really don't know how to basically go about it. Multiple topics are there. One is about charging network fees, and then we have the selective blocking. The issue is really complex, can't be covered in 2-3 minutes. But in order to make it a little more efficient, let me just handle a specific topic of selective blocking. Now, what is the purpose of selective blocking? The purpose of selective blocking is to ensure that we don't have a blanket ban of internet, which is very harmful. Because when you resort to blanket ban, the problem basically gets aggravated because people become unnecessary kind of a victim of an intent to curb some kind of issue of law and order, and there are many people who are using internet for their livelihood, and they get impacted. Now, the intent is quite fine, but if you look at it from a technical point of view, and I would like to make it a little bit simpler because I don't want to go too technical, otherwise I will lose the audience. See, look, normal blocking, how it is done. So let's understand the normal blocking, and I like to elevate the discussion to a much higher level. So we have base stations. Base stations have the capability to monitor and throttle traffic. It's very important to understand that you can throttle base stations traffic so that the base station is just like a pipe. You have some kind of knob. And if you basically use the knob to open the pipe, you actually have large flow of water. Similarly, base station actually has a capability, they call it policy and charging rule functions. Using that, you can basically throttle internet, and therefore anything which comes under the purview of base station will get throttled. And therefore that is how you basically block internet. And you know exactly where the base stations are located, and therefore you are able to control the internet reach in those areas, and you allow the voice function to continue. It's up to you what you want to do. You can also reduce the internet speeds to a much lower level, so it becomes completely useless from the point of view of messaging, right? So that's basically normal blocking. Now, what is selective blocking? Selective blocking means that you allow all the services to function except for few. For example, you block WhatsApp, you block messaging services. That's what the intent is. The problem is that in order to block selectively messaging services, you actually need to know. You can actually do it in two ways. You can do it in through the OTT way or through the telecom way, because there are two different entities who are basically responsible in delivering those services. So you can do it through OTT or through telecom. Now, if you're doing it through OTT, how does OTT player know which subscriber to block? Now, he needs to basically get some kind of identification. The identification that he gets is either the cell ID, which is basically the ID of the base stations where the information is basically being disseminated, or the location information of at the GPS level. Now, this two information, the location information, the GPS level, as well as cell ID, needs to be enabled throughout all the time, because you can't really start picking locations individually, selectively of the users, because you don't know which users to be blocked at when. So you need to keep transmitting this information across for all the users every time they use their service. Means it is basically going to be all universally all the time, which is going to be a very, very big issue, right? You can't let all this privacy information flowing out of the network, which can be misused, because this information can flow out of the country also, right? And it can track, very sensitive services, like even a defense guy actually carrying a cell phone, his location can be tracked. So this is not a useful way of doing it, because it is going to be very sensitive and can't be executed. So the other way of executing is basically through the network level. The network level means the destination IP address. Now, what is destination IP address? The destination IP address is the IP address of the server, which is actually providing the service. Let's say WhatsApp servers are located throughout the world, and you know exactly where the IP addresses of those servers are. And there are not just one or two servers, there are multiple such servers. Now, getting the IP address of those servers is a big challenge because those IP addresses are masks in order to prevent hacking, because basically the denial service of hacking is quite prevalent in the net. So you generally don't disclose those IP addresses, so you will not know the IP address. But you have a mechanism to basically get the IP address by doing deep packet investigation on the URL. URL is nothing but the web address basically you type. For example, if you see Chinese app, how those Chinese app got blocked? Because the URL of those apps basically was known. So once you block the URL, automatically everything gets blocked. But here it is not possible for you to block the URL because you need the IP addresses, right? Because URL basically will get translated into IP address into multiple servers, and therefore you can't do that. So therefore, when you do that, you need to basically do deep packet inspection every time you do the blocking, and that will basically create a huge problem in the network from the point of latency, and the network operators have to invest huge amount of money on infrastructure in order to do that. So to conclude in short, because there are many discussions which can happen on this topic on technical, it is simply not possible. I can tell you that it is not possible in any way. It has never been done anywhere in the world, and technically it is not possible. So I can stop here. If you want me to cover some other topic also, I can go, but in the interest of time, I just hand over the mic to you.
No, thank you, Parag. Perhaps in the next round, you can kind of share your other comments.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for it. And before I bring in Dr. Uppal, perhaps I would want Tejasi to come in. Tejasi from IFF, even you've written a lot in this. There are rights issues. There is a neutrality issue, while Parag highlighted the technical issue as in why it is not feasible. Would you want to highlight a bit on that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, first off, for inviting me to be part of this esteemed panel. I, on behalf of IFF, am extremely grateful for this opportunity. I am going to time myself. Okay, now I will quickly just provide some context and background with respect to efforts aimed towards regulating OTT services in India, just because I feel like this consultation is part of a journey that actually dates back to 2015, wherein TRAI released a consultation paper on the topic and made paternalistic statements in favor of regulation. It then released a consultation paper in 2018, which had two principal objectives. The first was to make sure that there is a continued economic investment in telecom and data networks. And the second was to cure any regulatory imbalance which existed between TSPs and their internet-based counterparts. And also consider if they can be actually considered as substitutes. In 2020, TRAI issued clear recommendations that were broadly supportive of user choice. This has already been discussed by Gowree, but briefly TRAI recommended allowing market forces to respond to the situation without any regulatory intervention. It also acknowledged that it is not an opportune moment to recommend a comprehensive regulatory framework for OTT services, and this was a big win for users. However, recently we've seen a return of the paternalistic stance, both in the telecom bill and TRAI's consultation paper on convergence of broadcasting and telecommunication services. Both papers have explored the idea of licensing or permission-based regulation for providing online services. Now, obviously, with the latest consultation paper on OTT services as well, TRAI has put forth the question of licensing and imposing regulatory burden on internet platforms and services. Interestingly, the very definition of OTT services have been left open for comments in the consultation paper. Now, OTT services itself is a telecom industry vernacular, which has been considered by many a sort of a reductionist term, which has limited the vibrant and innovative pace of applications and services. The Save the Internet.in campaign, which resulted in a massive public victory for net neutrality in India, also consistently avoided the use of the phrase OTT in preference for internet applications and services. Another issue that's been tackled is the classification of these services. Here I want to bring the focus to the fact that several services offer multiple functionalities, which may, for instance, include voice calling and instant messaging, even though their primary functionality may, for instance, be social networking. So in such a scenario of multiple functions, how would we classify them, say, as OTT communication or OTT content? Now, this is again illustrative of the reductiveness of a debate that commences from dulling the feature richness and diversity of such applications into the straitjacket of OTT. So for the purpose of this call, I will use the term OTT communication services, and that is the term that is used by TRAI. Now, regulation of OTT communication services has for a long time been a demand raised consistently by traditional telcos on the grounds of introducing a level playing field. Justification given is that similar or same rules must be applied for services offering similar same services. However, there are inherent structural differences between the two. And the primary one is that OTT services are essentially internet-based apps, and they do not own or even operate telecom equipment. Further, they do not enjoy some exclusive permissions that are enjoyed by telcos. And OTT communication sectors are also known to have huge investments in telecom infrastructures and networks, generate significant revenue for telcos, and they generate demand for broadband services. So the stolen profits argument also becomes questionable here. Now I'll quickly come to chapter 2, which deals with selective banning of OTT services. Now, highlighting the high economic and social cost of complete internet shutdowns, TRAI in this paper has suggested an alternative approach, that is selective banning of specific OTT applications and websites in specific regions which are likely to be used by terrorist or anti-national elements. Now, here some questions have arisen with respect to the technical ability to implement such bans. For instance, what are the processes or criteria based on which you will select or reject specific services or website for banning? Will all similar or comparable services be banned, or will that be taken up on a case-to-case basis? I raise that particular question because in 2020, a similar whitelisting approach was taken up in Jammu and Kashmir. And we saw that while some, for instance, travel planning websites were banned, others weren't. And this was also seen in other kinds of services. The Jammu Kashmir whitelisting order also stated that ISPs shall be responsible for ensuring that access is allowed to whitelisted sites. Now, what happens when URLs that are listed are invalid, indeterminate, or do not contain adequate information? Right? Someone asked a question about mode of accessing it, whether through websites or mobile. Will that be left to the discretion of an ISP? Because an ISP is essentially an intermediary which is not authorized to take judgment call on the orders they receive from the government or seek further clarity, right? So how will that play out? Research has also shown, in fact, that different ISPs deploy different techniques for banning services. Now, concern is that such inconsistency and ad hocism may lead to users having limited resources or no resources due to lack of ISP's accountability or transparency, increased compliance burden on MSMEs, and negative impact on user experience as well as their choice. So while TRAI's reasoning to prefer selective banning over complete shutdowns may seem reasonable, I feel like the technicalities of implementing such bans as well as its effectiveness must be examined before putting forth this proposal.
Thanks a lot, Tejasi, for sharing your views. Perhaps we will go to Dr. Uppal first, and then we'll come to the experts from the industry. So, Dr. Uppal, you've been seeing the telecom industry for a long time, and would you like to share your views on this particular debate?
Sure, Amrita, just half a second.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. You can see me and hear me, I hope.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and thank you for the generous words. I do understand that we have a very short period of time, and I certainly know my limitations. So I'm not going to talk about what has been so ably described by both Tejasi as well as Gowree in the beginning. And I'll focus really on the context of what we are talking about. And let me say a couple of things which I think have been said earlier in different ways, probably better, but I hope difference makes some difference. Okay, so it's to me very unclear why the TRAI has even been asked to review its OTT recommendations or give fresh ones, given that the old ones were just barely 3 years ago. The DOT or indeed the TRAI itself has offered no specific data point or development that justifies this review. So that is one point that I wanted to make. The definition of OTT certainly is not the issue, and I don't think it matters very much as to how we define it and there may be minor differences, but we know what we're talking about, I think. The real context, I think, is that the tension between network operators and OTT players is real. And the reason for that tension is that the OTTs simply cannot escape telcos, and telcos are losing leverage. They do not any longer control access to the consumer as they used to be able to in the past. For example, I can call all my WhatsApp contacts irrespective of which telcos network they use for internet, which is something that I could not do maybe 5 years ago when you really did have to go through the telco to access its customers. So that has changed, and that is obviously something which has serious commercial implications for telcos. And it's also important to recognize that the OTT regulation that we are talking about has both a domestic and an international angle. It is not simply about fair contribution to the network, as is being talked about mainly in Europe and elsewhere as well, because this problem is not recent. And in India, it's also about the regulatory burden. It's also the telcos, as Anjali also pointed out, actually face a much higher regulatory burden. And so some of the posturing that happens is actually indicative of that, because some of it is just proxy for something else, which we can discuss later if need be. So and there's a real challenge in India also is the overlap between the interests of the telecom companies and the government. The government wants greater control over OTT services, hence this whole thing about wanting selective banning and so on and so forth. And obviously it has some prospects of revenues also if it was regulated. And of course, as far as telcos are concerned, as we pointed out earlier, telcos, anything that improves their leverage, improves them, allows them to negotiate in a stronger position with OTT players is something that they would like, and having a regulatory burden on telcos, on OTT players will certainly improve or help improve their competitive advantage. So clearly, this is something which is rather worrying, I've always felt, because a kind of regulatory approach that we are all, or at least I am not, and most people who've spoken seem to be concerned about, enjoys an overlap of interest between the government and the telecom companies. That, I think, is a concern to me. It is not to remotely ignore the telcos' challenges. Telcos clearly face a very complex regulatory regime, licensing in particular. They pay large sums of money. And also the revenue sharing itself has the wrong incentives, as you know, because the better you do in the market, the more you pay the government, rather than being penalized for not performing or and so on and so forth. But that's a subject for another discussion. And spectrum auctions, again, are designed to maximize revenue for the government. And all of this essentially means an additional cost for telcos. which obviously has links with the sustainability of this network or its ability to attract investments. However, the kind of proposals we are talking about, they clearly are a far more serious problem, and they have very little to do with the problems we are talking about. First, and there are serious flaws, in my opinion, in the telco position itself. As Alexandre pointed out, there is no clear evidence that the OTTs are causing the crisis. Indeed, there is not even a consensus whether there is, in fact, a crisis, as again Alexandre pointed out. And there is also no guarantee that the network usage fee can fix this the problem. We don't know how, who will pay whom, etc. But a larger problem, which again is this whole business about functionality, which came up recently, which is that yes, the telcos service, let's say telephony or text messages, are very similar to the calls that you can make using OTT services like WhatsApp or Signal and so on and so forth. In fact, I would even go to the extent of saying that some of the OTT offerings are actually superior to the telco offerings. But that in itself does not justify similar regulatory treatment, because the two services are the providers of these services are not placed symmetrically. They're not on identical footings. They're not equals, as many have pointed out, whether in terms of their rights or their obligations, whether they're or the nature of their businesses. And even where this commonality of functionality or the common functionality, forgive my wordiness, the functionality has been acknowledged, even there, regulators have been very careful. For instance, the EU position is specific EU approach to treat telcos and OTTs communication similarly is limited to number-based services. In other words, OTTs that actually are mapping their services onto phone numbers, or indeed that an OTT service that can actually access a number direct and not simply between two subscribers of the same service, like say WhatsApp. If I could call a phone number instead of a WhatsApp subscriber, then I would be treated differently. But the same functionality, if it is between two WhatsApp subscribers or any other subscriber, is not treated the same. The same thing with emergency services. As you know, this was always has been an issue for many decades, actually, whether IP-based OTT services should also have obligations about emergency services. And the FCC and other regulators have been very clear about what is reasonable to expect from OTT services in terms of emergency access and what is not. So, for instance, the OTT services are unable to provide you a unique geographic location when you call an emergency service, and that is accepted, and that is something that the telco is not that the OTT player is not expected to provide, and that distinction is kept. And I also have pointed out elsewhere that this whole argument about same service, same rules actually is to a large extent regulatory fiction. Because while it is true that players which are similarly placed must be treated similarly, we must recognize that you would have no Competition Commission of India, you would have no competition regulation if functionality alone decided how you should be regulated. Players with larger market, greater market power are expected to be treated differently, and newer players, new entrants are regulated much more lightly, across the world, wherever economic regulators are. So I do believe that the kind of proposals we are discussing are very problematic. The network usage fee is particularly problematic. It's not clear who will pay to whom. Is this payment expected to be made to a telco? If so, how? If it is made with the USOF or the Universal Service Fund, then how would that work? And would that actually meet the telco request or telco concerns? Similarly, if this is how we're going to deal with usage of networks, then clearly will other utilities follow suit? For example, would the air conditioner company have to pay separately because it uses higher levels of electricity?
Sorry, Dr. Uppal, if you could.
I finished, and I'm in my lab. So the allocating responsibility between suppliers and users is going to be a major thing. I will stop right here and thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And we'll come back to you. I know there's a lot to speak, but so sorry to.
No, absolutely. I appreciate. Thank you very much.
And we'll go to Vartika now. Vartika, you are from NASCOM and you have, members, all kinds of members. So how are you all looking at this discussion from NASCOM's point of view?
Thanks, Amrita. So I think I'll begin by complimenting the telecom operators, for being the underlying network for all kinds of OTT players, apps, value-added services, everybody. So when OTT services started, they were basically dependent on the telecom networks and telecom providers, which continues even today. What has changed is that even the telcos are now dependent on OTTs. If you look at this TRAI paper, I think, TRAI has given a very balanced approach in saying how data in the past 10 years has gone up 10 times, from 8% to 85%. How ITU, bodies like ITU and other international organizations are saying how the OTTs have actually helped telcos increase their revenues, have actually contributed to social benefits and all kinds of, important activities that are required. I'm sure everybody's gone through the paper, ITU has very beautifully said how OTT was a savior for many citizens all over the world during the pandemic. And everybody agrees to that. So my point is, these obviously the debate about saying, my revenue is being stolen by the TSPs. Today, almost 99% of the plans that all the telcos offer have free voice and SMS. You are actually charging for data. And the data is primarily being used for the OTTs. So there was a Nokia report in 2020, which was their MBIT report, which said every Indian, on an average, every Indian user spends 70 minutes per day on the OTT. And I'm sure that number has gone up during the pandemic. It is true for all of us. It's not just any random user. It is true for all of us. So somewhere, we have to see that mix of maybe voice and data, or maybe voice and SMS is not being used as much as it was. And maybe the other OTT, whether they are communication services or, entertainment services are being used more by the subscribers. But ultimately, they all come at a cost. And these are shown in the data revenues of the telcos. What I think ITU has also very clearly stated, and I'm sure everybody will agree, that there is a need to collaborate. We know, telcos, you have lots of regulatory obligations. There are fair share of obligations on OTTs too. It's just that they do not come from DOT. They come from some other ministry. And in terms of equating those, OTTs cannot have a rollout obligation. They cannot, have a spectrum usage charge or anything for which they are not, providing that kind of service or for an asset that they do not own. Obviously, for telcos, the regulatory obligations will be more because you own more assets, which in a way is true. And I think we can work. All of us should be in sync to work towards reducing these regulatory burdens. That is something one of the previous speakers also said. But having said that, when ITU says there is a need to collaborate, And when they talk of collaboration, they're primarily talking of collaboration in terms of consumer protection, in terms of providing benefits to the subscribers, consumers, in terms of innovation, sustainable investments by both sets, whether it is telcos or it is the OTTs. And by the way, I think Alex or somebody pointed out that there is significant investment that has been done by OTTs, whether it is in data centers, in CDNs. In fact, there's an India-specific report which was done by Research and Markets in 21, and they said in 2021 about over 55 billion USD investment was done by some of the OTTs within the country. So, numbers for India are also available there. Having said that, obviously we need to collaborate, and let's see how we can leverage both sets, telcos and OTTs can actually leverage this innovation and make it more beneficial for the consumers and the subscribers of the country. Coming to the network usage charges, since we're discussing the TRAI paper, I failed to see a direct question by TRAI where they're actually talking of a network usage fee. From whom to who, or going from one set to the other is not the question. They have mentioned, about their paper on voluntary commercial agreement, but there is no direct question by TRAI on it. So the question is actually, where is it coming from? It may be a debate for another day that, that can take place, but I don't think in this specific current paper, this is really required. Very quickly, I'll move on to the selective banning, on which I have a very short point because, technical economic experts all have spoken. Probably, technically, I think Mr. Parag very clearly stated that it is just not possible. Selective banning is just not possible. In short, he said that. We agree it's not possible. But I also have a very far-fetched view on this banning. We know that India, has maximum internet bans, and there are many reports to show that. In fact, Career did one a few years back. And I also feel that banning of internet or shutdown of internet has been really abused in the country. It's not just for major incidents or stopping antisocial activities. They are being used by government for various menial activities, I would like to say. So it cannot be done. I think there is a need to look at a fresh approach, and it's not just the industry, the telcos or OTTs or somebody can look at it. It has to be a collaborative effort by the government, by the industry to see how, and more from the government side, I would say, to actually see how you can curb the kind of activities that you are wanting to curb just by banning the internet or shutting down the internet. That's a bigger debate. Looking at selectively banning or shutting the entire internet is not going to serve the purpose anyways. With that, Amrita, I think I'll stop here quickly. Thanks. And maybe come back later.
Thanks a lot, Vartika, for the points. And I echo your sentiments about banning, because while there are several reports which has come up on the harms of banning from the rights perspective, economic perspective, opportunities perspective. However, there is no clear indicative data of that banning has helped in any way to address the concerns. As in, there are legitimate concerns. Perhaps it's not been, this may not be the means. And as you mentioned, there has to be a lot of discussion between different stakeholders, and people from the technical background also needs to be in the discussion because they understand how technology works. And so, human rights perspective, etc., because we have seen it being abused. And personally, I find the selective banning very concerning, but we'll come back to it. I'll bring in Uttara now. Uttara, you also represent an OTT company. Would you like to share your views?
Yes, thank you, Amrita. I think going last means that I'll have the least unique things to say, but it also sort of takes the pressure off. So I will say this, at Snap, we're obviously watching this discussion very, very closely. And overall, we're keen to contribute to the collective effort of the ecosystem to help try internalize the idea that infrastructure providers and application providers are different and that they need distinct regulations. right? Now, to this effect, I thought I'll make some broad observations about the regulatory environment that content and application providers such as ourselves are situated in, right? And of course, Gowree and Tejasi did do some of that already earlier. And then I will provide, hopefully that context setting will provide some frame for my recommendations as an OTT company for TRAI on 3 specific issues that stuck out to us. So broadly, from our perspective, content and application providers are subject to an enormous amount of regulation, right? To my mind, the top of mind regulations include the Information Technology Act and their rules, the Consumer Protection Act and rules, and the Competition Act as well, right? Now, we're also in the midst of a very compliance-heavy digital personal data protection bill being passed in Parliament, and there's also a lot of concomitant debate on the Digital India Act, which will come to be a thing, say, sometime next year. Now, beyond all of these, depending on the funding and the specific sector that a company might operate in, GAPs or OTTs are also subject to a bunch of like FDI regulation as well, right? And to my mind, all of these together provide for a really comprehensive legal regime, right? They address a host of market failures, things like trust, safety, reliability, consumer welfare, national security even. All of the laws that I just mentioned are sort of framed to solve for market failures in these various areas, right? So in a sense, when our team was examining the latest TRAI paper, I think my colleagues and I were sort of keen to understand the why behind the paper, right? What is the specific policy objective it's seeking to solve? And I think broadly speaking, our sense is that implementing a parallel registration / licensing sort of regime for the tech industry under a telecommunications framework will basically hamper the growth of the ecosystem, right? And our TLDR recommendation broadly is for regulatory forbearance. But that being said, I think I'll also sort of go into 3 things that sort of stuck out to us as, in a sense, a CAP or an OTT provider, right? The first one, of course, is with defining and classifying OTTs. And I was very struck by Gowree's comments on this as well. I'd say this broadly. Now, even with the discussion around the DIA, right? There is a sense about how we need to create the policy objective of the government seems like they want to essentially create a future-ready framework for the country that enables innovation, right? To my mind, this sort of function-based classification broadly from a regulatory perspective is counter to that objective of enabling innovation, right? And I think the challenge really lies, as Gowree had rightly pointed out, in creating a uniform definition that works across different jurisdictions and contexts, okay? But also sort of is befitting of an environment in where there are multiple different types of services and where services themselves shapeshift quite a bit. For instance, there could be in Snapchat itself, you can do person-to-person communication, but you also have a part of the app that offers broadcast features or curated content, for instance, right? And applications such as ourselves, as well as many others, have been able to shape-shift because and create these new product changes and functional changes because there is this sort of enabling environment of the current framework. To my mind, if you have this new regulatory framework or burden, you are in a sense disincentivizing companies from making that shape-shifting happen overnight or over a few months, right? And that, especially in this time where we've seen in the last year, the way AI has changed the way products look, right? It would be a death knell in a sense for innovation. That's the broad point on the classification of OTTs. The second, on infrastructure cost sharing, I feel like a lot of the previous speakers have covered this very eloquently. But really, from Snap's perspective, our broad recommendation is to avoid the mandating of a collaborative framework or revenue sharing framework between TSPs and OTTs, right? Number one, as others have already pointed out, this is going to run in the fly of net neutrality principles. In 2017, TRAI really came up with what the world regarded as a gold standard in a sense, right, of net neutrality principles for the country. But the other thing I'll say is that I was very struck by Anjali's comments on this matter. And I think in this otherwise very, very polarized and sometimes cantankerous debate, what we can all agree on is the fact that TRAI should be focusing on addressing the economic stress that the telecom sector is currently facing, right? And perhaps that means things like competition reform or like price regulation, and essentially liberalizing the operational conditions for telecom operators. To my mind, that is a much more valid problem statement to be addressed rather than sort of deflecting and making this about OTTs and regulatory arbitrage. The third thing I'll say is on selective banning. Again, something that struck us as unclear what gap is sought to be addressed. Parag, of course, very eloquently addressed the technical infeasibility of actually having selective bans, right? Because they can be circumvented and they're operationally, frankly, impossible, as you've mentioned. But crucially, I think something that also struck us was the fact that, there's already a comprehensive regulatory framework in India for content moderation, which is hopefully the intent behind doing this. MeitY as well as MIB now have the power to tell you to turn something off on the application or take something down and have you do that in a super expedited manner. Right. To my mind, adding a new regime for selective banning would create confusion and, of course, reduce sort of legal certainty for applications. And I think that to the extent that there is a need for improvements in the whole 79 regime, right, from the perspective of more transparency, judicial oversight, and proportionality, I still don't think that the TRAI consultation of the telecom law in any form is the correct space for this sort of reform. I do think that discussions around this, about improvement of process, that discussion should happen within the ambit of the Digital India Act, right? And in a way that sort of takes into account the many considerations from the perspective, of course, technical feasibility, but then also like the impact of such things on like the digital freedoms of Indians. So I think that debate needs to happen in a different context. And overall, again, over here, we fail to understand why TRAI has raised this question. So I'll stop there. Super happy to be in this panel.
Thanks, Uttara, for sharing the perspective from an OTT, as in, these are concerning. And if I look at the end user perspective, looking at what happened in Korea, the costs went up. So the end users bear the brunt. And if there is a net neutrality concern, and even when the consultation in EU was going on, there were, countries had also raised this issue. I think Netherlands had that there is a possibility of even having a net neutrality issue when you go in for a network usage fees, etc. Or, a telco and an OTT gets into handshaking in a different way. So certain things may be prioritized. So those are concerns. So for the next round, I will give each of the speakers 4 minutes to kind of counter or add something. And perhaps, Anjali, I'll go to you because you heard a lot. And if you want to kind of share your views or other points which you may have missed.
Thanks, Amrita. So I think not much to add except to say conversations are important. If there's an issue that is being flagged, if, as Dr. Uppal is recognizing that there is a concern, and if there is a manner in which other countries are dealing with the issue, then it is important that India too should be part of that conversation. We can't just hide behind and say, "Nahi, it's not required. There is going to be difficulty. There will be NN issues." Talk it out. Let's discuss. Like I said, on the communication piece, let's ask for lighter touch for everybody. Fine. Selective banning or unblocking of the internet is important because lives are getting affected. We do want it, and if it's never going to be a full unblocking, then selective unblocking in the manner in which, whether it is a telco-led thing, if that can be done technically, or whether it can be done by the tech companies, that is a conversation that needs to be had. Network usage fee conversation. So all I'm saying is that let's not just close the door and say, no, this is not the way to go. I said we need to discuss it. We need the issues to be, at least raised. People do understand that there are concerns and there are valid concerns. How that is to be solved is something that we need to sit down and discuss. Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali. And perhaps next we would go to Parag.
Yeah, so I'll just basically go in a very specific dimension, which actually hasn't been spoken about on the main topic about charging fees from network usage fees. That is basically the point of contention. Now, I like to basically say that let's go into fundamentals. Let's understand what the problem is. The problem is basically in India is what monetization of network. Now, for the operators' ability to monetize network, they need to have some method of gaining to extract more from what they are able to do today. Today, the networks actually have become pipe. And why it has become pipe? Let's focus on the TRAI's February 8th order of 2016 on net neutrality. If you go through that order, you will basically get the answer, where it clearly says that you can't discriminate, right? As long as you are basically transmitting internet traffic, you cannot discriminate. But fortunately, the order actually has a definition called specialized service. Those specialized service can be discriminated and can be monetized, but there is no clear definition of specialized service. That's one. The second problem that we have in India is that the capacity of the network is pretty poor. When I say poor, I'm not talking about the spectrum bands, which are actually above 6 gigahertz or at the level of 3.5 gigahertz. We are basically talking about the bands which are can be optimizedly deployable from a base station point of view, the lower frequency band. They are basically priced like gold and platinum, and the quantum of spectrum in these bands are so insignificant that you really don't have capacity. So when you don't have capacity, everybody is tussling, fighting in this particular small pipe to basically make their way through. And that's where the pain is. The pain is because spectrum has been priced like gold, platinum, and the quantum of spectrum is lying unused. Loads of spectrum is lying unused in the low frequency band, and whatever has been doled out in minuscule quantity to the service provider. 600 megahertz band, all the spectrum is lying vacant, not unused. 700 megahertz, everything has been given to state public sector unit. 800 megahertz band, 50% of the band is lying vacant. 900 megahertz band, 50% of the band is lying vacant, and whatever is basically been used is basically, if you look at the band structure, you'll find that Bharti and Vodafone is completely stuck with the spectrum for 4G, and there is a large portion of the spectrum in 700 megahertz band is used by BSNL for 2G. So you have to think of all this. Legal argument is fine, but let's talk fundamentals. Fundamentals, when you talk about fundamentals, you really get stuck. The issue is actually much more than what we are talking specifically in this narrow regulation. These aspects are not getting discussed. These are the primary reason for the problem. You go to the doctor is basically look at you and basically diagnose you on the fundamentals, what the problem is, rather than basically look at your face and give you some medicine and you'll become all right. That's not the way it works, right? So that's where the issue is, and that's where it pinches, right? For the telecom operators to run OTT services, and they are basically looking at monetizing the OTT services when they really can't fight the government, because they've been fighting the government for such a long period of time and nothing is working, right? So that's the crucial point of debate, right? Structure the regulation in such a way that you have enough capacity on the air so that everybody can monetize it, use it for their purpose. OTT can use it, the operators can segment. Now with 5G, all the network can be segmented, slicing can happen, a lot of things can happen. What will happen? What the operators are doing with 5G today? Let's ask this question. Have you got any benefit for 5G? I would say zero. There is absolutely no benefit, right, for 5G services that we have been able to experience. And we are basically claiming victory that 5G has come and this has happened and that has happened. So unless these things are unlocked, these capabilities are unlocked, then this debate will continue to happen, right? And the operators will keep on looking at the monetization, and that's why this debate is. Okay, so I'll just stop here and I'll pass.
Thank you so much. And you brought a very valid point that the fundamentals need to be corrected rather than trying to, do some cosmetic changes above. And with that, I go to Tejasi. Tejasi, would you like to comment?
Sure. The first point is something that we didn't discuss so far. That's with respect to regulation in respect to lawful interception. And this is something that TRAI is seeking comments on. Now, for us at least, this is an incredibly concerning issue, as we know that, and we need to step back and realize that India does not have a data protection law. And even if we consider that later this week we will have a functional data protection law, it's still, the current iteration still lacks a provision on surveillance reform within its ambit. So any conversation which progresses to argue for expanding the applicability of lawful interception, that too in the absence of relevant safeguards, is completely against user interest. And again, at IFF, we are primarily looking at this discourse from the lens of its effect on users, right? And we believe that this regulatory approach may create an environment of uncertainty and increased burden, not just for OTT communication services, but also for OTT communication users. For example, requiring them to contribute to the infrastructure costs incurred by telcos may result in higher prices for consumers. Now, the second point I would like to make, related point, after listening to everybody today, is that there is no disputing that there is an increasing economic burden faced by telcos. In fact, IFF conducted an analysis over a period of 7 years based on the financials publicly released by telcos. And so that fact, there is no disputing that fact. What is concerning, though, is the regulatory approach suggested by TRAI, which will lead to imposition of financial burdens or levies on internet applications and services. Here, rather than protecting company profits of either telcos or OTTs, the goal of regulation should be to serve the public's best interests. And the last point I would like to make it, and I just briefly touched upon by another speaker, is that in this consultation paper, TRAI has conducted a comparative analysis of regulatory documents and proposals in foreign jurisdictions, international bodies, etc. And in one particular instance in which it has done so is to get a firmer understanding of OTT communication services and its definition, right? Now, the problem here in this approach is that India has in the past adopted a very indigenous progressive approach towards net neutrality, and it has sort of set the norms for net neutrality under the leadership of TRAI, in fact. So even in this case, while India may very well learn from comparative models under development in other countries, I think we have an opportunity to help set global standards once again. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tejasi. And we will go to Dr. Uppal next for his comments. You are muted, Dr. Uppal.
Thanks. Actually, I'm quite all right. I'd much rather that people had time for questions. So okay. I have nothing very specific at this point to add. So
fair enough. We'll come to you on the Q&A.
But I'll be happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you. So we go to Vartika and then Uttara.
Hi, thanks, Amrita. So actually, it's good to see that almost everybody is kind of is on the same page, saying that, there is a burden on telcos. Everybody agrees that, that burden needs to be reduced in whichever manner, and obviously it just cannot be passed on to somebody else to say, okay, reduce my burden, but there are ways and means, and it needs a collaborative, comprehensive approach by all stakeholders, whether it is government, whether it is, the industry, to actually sit and see what can be done. So, some speakers have spoken about how and what kinds of burdens are there. TRAI and DOT, I believe, instead of, trying to just ignite this debate about what to do with telcos and what to do with DOT, they should actually try and sit and resolve the problem. Look at what can be done. And if they want to look at international practice, I think, they should. This is something where they should go and see how other jurisdictions are, pricing the spectrum, how other jurisdictions are actually giving kind of reforming the sector to actually give some kinds of waivers to the industry. We have multiple examples of countries where 5G spectrum was given away for free. Why is it that India could not follow that suit, and why is it that they want to continue this debate? I would just want to conclude by saying, there is a need to just sit together and resolve this, because as I said earlier, both sides are interdependent on each other. One cannot live without the other, today or in the future. So with that, I'll take a
Thanks,
stop.
Kartika. Uttara, do you have any comments?
This is a really quick and brief comment. I've been watching this debate since 2017. It was very early in my career. And what's become quite clear to me is that actually, we sort of keep having this debate every 2 years or so. There's a new consultation that asks the same question in a different sort of way. And I think the one issue that hasn't quite been threadbare discussed is this, as Vartika said, this whole idea about disburdening the telecom sector, right? And how do you ensure that there are fewer licenses, fewer permissions for the telcos? So that to me is one important thing. And the second thing I'll say is that, overall, this when you take a step back, what strikes me about this particular debate and this particular consultation is that, one big part of government is talking about enabling innovation, creating really room for startups and other technology companies to grow and really proliferate over the next 10 years or so in a very serious kind of way. And many developments are in a sense paving the way for that process, right? It seems to me as if this particular debate, when it keeps rising at the same time as one part of government saying, hey, we want to innovate, we want to create an enabling environment, it is confusing for companies, and it sort of creates a lot of uncertainty with regard how much business needs to be done in India, right? And that, I think, will continue to be a bit of a thing as long as we don't really address the real problem and sort of the framing of this debate, if it continues to sort of be the political thing that it is globally as well as here, I don't know, it seems like we're just sort of going around in circles and not really talking about what's the actual problem. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Uttara. And, the question for the audience is also to think as in, if you would want to share your comments, questions, etc. to the speakers, you can put it in the chat or you can raise your hand. But before that, perhaps I may want to bring in Gowree and Alex, as in, if you want to share your comments on what could be the ways to reduce the burden for the telcos, or if there is anything else you would want to add to this discussion. And I can see Gowree's put up her camera, so over to you, Gowree.
No, I think I had already put up some of my comments. I'm not sure everybody has had a chance to read, but I think two quick things. I think on the selective blocking, if there is this entire confusion as to whether even it is possible, right? That's the whole question. But I think I want to take a few steps back and see that why are we even talking about it, right? When anything is excessive, that is where all these issues arise. And that is what exactly as the Supreme Court has said on the proportionality principles, etc. in the 2020 case, it has laid down. There has to be an analysis done about all the orders that have already been issued to say that, okay, whether the same principles are being followed or not. And if that issue is reduced, then, the anxiety over this banning, etc., or etc., may also get reduced, right? Because if there is no solution to achieve selective banning, and as Uttara rightly said, 69A already takes care of several of these issues, at a platform level, and even at a TRAI single, case also had said that you can't just shut down, certain things or a certain even a profile level, banning, right? So I think that is where the proportionality principles have to be discussed, and with the specifics. The problem that we are facing today, we just discuss at a global level. When I say global, I mean very high level. We need to look at specific issues and see where the issue really lies, and then only we are able to find a solution to the problem. I think on the telco part, I think even the TRAI chairman has, during some of the open forums, has made these statements, and I echo that we need to revisit the complete framework, because we have been with that, with the age-old acts for a while. Even when we are looking at a telecom bill or otherwise, can we reduce the burden on telcos? Three-level burden, right? One is the overall compliance burden. I'm talking about, the technical compliance burden, etc. Is there any, any way to reduce that? I'm not a technical person, but that is one overall area. Second, of course, the fees, right? And the license fees and all of that. I think that is one area. If, there has to be a complete economic solution to the problem, right? If at all there is a problem, you can't just look at on one side. So one has to look at a comprehensive solution to, can you say that, okay, we can give certain, reliefs to the telecom operators, the entire issue of GGR we have been discussing forever, right? So some of these reliefs, if these can be discussed, even the past cases and all of that, I know there have been conversations, but you have to look at it holistically, and that has to be a sustainable sector for OTTs also to continue, right? So I'm not getting into specifics here, but that is the way that the people have to sit across the table, have this, clear, conversations, rather than just doing these consultation papers where thousands of papers are, pages are written and submitted. I don't think there are real conversations that are happening unless, you have forums like this, but these needs to happen at the government level.
Right. Thank you, Gowree. As in, you raised important points that the conversations have to happen before something comes in, and just bringing papers may not be that effective apart from the other issues. Alex, do you want to share something? Your comments on it?
Yes. A very interesting discussion. First of all, here in Europe, very interestingly, the concept of OTTs really captures the voice messaging or video messaging applications, not so much the kind of companies that are now subject to that debate around network usage fees, like we're talking cloud providers and therefore their customers indirectly. We're talking streaming platforms. We're not really talking about, this discussion around level playing field among OTTs, understood as, the WhatsApp and Snapchat of this world, and telcos. We've had that discussion actually in Europe not so long ago, and I understand that this is a recurring discussion you're having in India. I was struck by some of the comments that Parag made earlier around, what is the real problem. If maybe forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing your comments, but it seemed to me that the essence is telcos aren't making as much money as some tech companies. Okay, but these operate in vastly different verticals at the end of the day. You could have a sort of a very narrow niche discussion and debate over whether WhatsApp as such compete with SMS text services. But, at the end of the day, you can't possibly compare, for example, a streaming service, that's one business, versus a telco service. That's a completely different business. Maybe two questions that I could raise to the audience, but maybe Parag as well, if he wants to jump in. At the end of the day, what we are talking about is that some content and online service providers would have to pay a toll fee, right? The question, considering that, in most cases, you have telcos that have their own businesses, their telco business. They may have also additional verticals as well, which compete with online service providers. Considering this, I mean, if you bring a real life sort of analogy as well, like for example, do actually car manufacturers do they pay a toll fee in the real life? They don't, right? Because car manufacturers, at least in my view, they don't compete with road infrastructure companies in the first place. Maybe just a few thoughts here. Fundamentally, I understand there is merit in having a discussion around level playing field discussion between some teeny tiny segment of what the online services and content services are about and how they compare with telco services. But the vast majority of the telco services, of the online services that we're talking about, at least here in Europe, around network usage fees, we're not talking about WhatsApp, we're talking cloud providers, we're talking streaming services. We're talking content delivery network service providers as well.
Thank you, Alex. And I see Parag's hand up and even Dr. Uppal's. Parag, you can go up.
Yeah, the reason I am basically, I put my hand up because I was referred to on that. I just want to clarify. See, Europe is more rational, no doubt about it, from the point of view of narrative. Reason I say that, you're right. When you say that it is more of streaming services than this less data-centric or data-intensive interaction of OTT, right? WhatsApp and others. But in India, the distortion is of a second level of magnitude. It is actually, if you look at the regulation, you will find that in India, even linear TV is allowed under OTT without having to follow the rules which TRAI has actually laid out to regulate linear TV. So if you talk about distortion, distortion is not limited to the debate that we are talking about here. It's actually much beyond this debate. There are fragmentation in regulation in every aspect. And let me make it a little bit more clear so that you understand. In India, if you are basically offering linear TV services using IPTV, using DTH, using hits, you have to pay 10% license fee. Okay, that's the revenue share you have to pay. But if you're offering linear TV over OTT, you pay 0% license fee. Okay, so you have a regulatory structure which is promoting usage of linear TV over the telecom network, which is wireless as well as wireline. So what are we talking about here, right? So therefore, the debate is skewed, the narrative is skewed. It is not being discussed specifically on issues which are of relevance. We are talking about things which are completely out of relevance, right? Like it does not matter what we are talking about here because it really doesn't impact, as you said. OTT does not impact the network services at all compared to what the linear TV and the streaming services impact. But the regulation says otherwise.
Thank you, Parag. And since you're here, there was a question from Shudipto, who's asking, how would you rate or review the structural reforms or rationalization of AGR and bank guarantee number, as you see, allowing 100% FDI, etc., introduced by the government in 2021? Assuming the reforms are not living up to the expectations, then what could be the possible reason?
Okay, so look, this is a very loaded and very difficult question to answer, but let me be very brief and precise. Look, we actually have inherited revenue share because of a regime which was dysfunctional, which was not properly structured. Let me tell you again what the fundamental reason for us getting into revenue share and how to come out from it. We got into revenue share because we structured an auction in 1995 with a deferred payment structure. No upfront payment, everything was deferred. Means you pay when you basically earn revenue, but that revenue, that deferred payment was basically fixed, not as a percentage of revenue. So when you have deferred payment structure in an auction and you hold an auction in that with such rules, you definitely you will have blown out of proportion auction prices. You didn't hold the auction properly. And then later you came out with a revenue share regime, and that revenue share regime had a lot of distortions, but you can't get away with it because you are actually having a legacy to deal with, which is actually a legal issue which you got into in 1999 when the revenue share agreement happened between the operator. It's like a settlement happened between the operators, right? And the government. Now, how do you deal with that situation? Only way to deal with the situation, slowly fade it away. You can't take revenue share away. You can basically bring it to a lowest common denomination, which is 1%. That's the way to get rid of revenue share, because revenue share is not working. It actually created fragmentation. It created this whole problem about this court case, where the Supreme Court case, where so much penalties were basically imposed. And today the network is, the operators are sick. Some of the operators are sick only because of this lost case which they lost in Supreme Court. And the funny part is that government fought for 20 years on an issue which they gave away after losing the Supreme Court case, as if that it was not an issue at all. Like the fragmentation of revenue share into two different compartments, telecom and non-telecom, was an issue of the government, and that's why the government was fighting for 20 years, right? Now they gave away that demand after winning the Supreme Court case. So it's like completely, nonsensical. I really don't understand. If there was an issue, why are you fighting for it, right? And if you won, then why did you give it away? So anyway, I see this is a very long debate. I really will not be able to satisfy all your requirements. We can have a separate debate later on various aspects of regulation in India. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Uppal, before you come in and make your intervention, there were 2-3 questions. You may want to look at them. Lokendra was asking about, what is... he wants to understand more on the issue of telcos with OTTs in terms of, when they are fundamentally a bit different. And then Shiksha is talking about how valid is the demand of ISPs for network fees when there exist different market mechanisms like peering, transit agreements through which market prices arise and thus ensure the burden of fees are balanced. And Kalpesh is asking what can be the possible golden means at this point of time so that telcos will be able to remain on a level playing field to curb monopoly and the citizen interest at large is concerning because until now also most of the population is out of coverage to the internet.
Wow. Thank you. Just a couple of points. I don't know if I can do justice to the many questions asked, but I think we have a couple of things. One is that we often forget that this business about parity between OTT and telco players is a uniquely Indian feature. In fact, other than the fact that telcos need a separate license to get spectrum out, there is really no difference in the regulation per se of telcos and OTT players across Europe and elsewhere. And I think, this, as Parag and I have spoken about, I don't know. As Parag and I have spoken over the years, this is actually a kind of an aberration of the Indian licensing regime. And I think it is something that has continued for so many years and has affected not just other players, but also the telcos themselves, because now there's with contributions such as revenue sharing, etc., which actually are not only hurting them, but have now created perverse incentives for actually demands to punish competitors. Let us assume that telcos and OTTs are competitors in, say, the voice business or even in the text business. So the argument seems to be that because these players are not competing fairly because we are regulated much greater or much higher than the others, therefore they must also be punished. And I think this is obviously a problem. In fact, an expert many years ago said that the business of regulation is to prevent unearned profits. But here we are not talking about unearned profits. This is not the business of regulation to settle market disputes. This is, if for whatever reasons the telco business is less competitive or less attractive today or less profitable, then that is not something that is an issue for regulators, unless regulation itself is the cause of this particular problem. And in some cases, regulation is, as Parag very rightly mentioned. So we need to be very clear about this, that the way forward is, in fact, to ensure that we remove any regulatory burdens which have nothing to do with the usage of natural resources or scarce resources like spectrum. If we do that overnight, several of these same service, same rule arguments will vanish into thin air, and we will have a cleaner this thing. The second thing may be we seem to have assumed that the TRAI is leaning in a certain direction, which it often is. But I think, to be fair to them, in this particular consultation, they seem to be pushing back. They seem to have even questioned the reason for, in fact, they claim very explicitly that they dealt with all the issues raised by the new reference in the previous recommendations itself, except, of course, the business of shutting down or banning apps. Almost everything that was that has been referred to for a review to the TRAI is, in fact, already something that they made recommendations on very recently. And as Gowree also pointed out, they were all, by and large, they took the user side, and they were actually more in favor of user choice and user convenience. I think, not Gowree, I think Tejasi pointed that out, and I think this is very important. I don't think it's a done deal, but let us hope that the TRAI can actually, and in this particular instance, particularly invoke regulatory best practices and insist, as many of us have implied, that the real problems to be solved are the distortions in our licensing regime. In fact, I do believe that a large number of problems that we are talking about have their genesis in our licensing regime, which is actually quite retrograde, and which unfortunately is precisely what the new telecom bill will exacerbate instead of resolve. So that is a big worry. But I'll stop here. I hope I've addressed some of those questions, but if there's more, I'll be happy to take.
Well, thank you so much, sir. As in, you have addressed. We have another 5 minutes for the open round, just in case anyone has any questions for the speakers, or any of the speakers wants to make a comment, as in Vartika or Uttara or Tejasi, on any of those points. Feel free to jump in. Okay, I see none. Then perhaps, is there any last comments any of the speakers would like to make?
So, Amrita, if I can just...
Yes, please, Anjali.
Not exactly close, but some facts out of government press release on the costs, that around 1.5 lakh crores spent in acquiring spectrum through auction in 2022 alone. Almost 24 lakh BTSs have been set up by December 22. Internet connections have grown from 25 crores to 83 crores, a growth of 232%. Average revenue realization per GB has reduced by more than 96%. Average monthly data consumption per wireless data subscriber has increased 266 times. So I think this is data which the government has put out, which basically shows the kind of financial squeeze that we are seeing, where the investments are being made and it is being used, but the recompense is not coming.
Thank you, Anjali, for sharing those figures. And any of the speakers wants to make any last minute, 1 minute intervention before we conclude the call? I see none. So let me take the opportunity to thank the speakers, as well as everyone who has been here in this call today. As in, we definitely had a lot of good points coming up, and I also learned a lot, and I hope the others in the call also could benefit for this. Thank you so much. And as we would be working on a report on this meeting, the key takeaways, and we would be circulating it, though the deadline for TRAI had a deadline of 4th for the consultation, but we hear it is going to be extended. So we hope that others in the call can also make their submissions, and so that there is a balanced perspective which the TRAI gets, because there needs to be nuanced discussions and nuanced directives coming up, which is actionable. Else we have consultation after consultation coming up with no response. There are lack of actionables, deliverables, or improvement of situations, I would say. So thank you so much, everyone. And we will keep you posted on the developments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amrita.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amrita.
Thanks, all.